Hi everyone, my name is Hayden and today we're going to be talking about CSS frameworks in the context of ReactJS. So in ReactJS, there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can make CSS come to life on the page and that you can structure your CSS. Today we're really interested in learning about probably the easiest way to build large-scale applications as quickly as possible. So let's first take you through just a couple of the key ways that you can use CSS in ReactJS, right? So for this particular lecture, I've gone and gotten a simple React app set up for us. And that React app is hiding inside the CSS frameworks. And it's just a typical one that we're used to seeing many times. What you'll notice in all of the default React apps is that they all have this import /app.css that you've seen from other lectures. And this is the method one you see up here, which we've already covered, which is importing style sheets directly. We're going to jump today to the second and kind of on the other end of the spectrum, very abstracted, very easy approach, which is to use a component library like Material UI, which is an example library we're using today. We're using a component library so that we don't have to go and write all this CSS for things like buttons and tables and headers and everything else, and we can just get it coded quickly. So a library like Material UI, it's a simple website, MUI, Material UI, and it's designed for applications like React to be easily installed. And you can see here that well, in this one it is a React library. If I want to get started using it, I can just literally go and copy and paste that install command here, and it will go and install some of the key components, the key modules from NPM that we need to make this happen. In the meantime, whilst that's installing, I'm just going to go and clear this out so that I can start off with a really simple page. We're just going to keep this whole thing very simple, and once this is done, we'll start up our React app. And whilst that's happening, if we go to the Material UI website and we start looking through their docs, and we go to the sidebar here, you'll actually see here that there's a whole bunch of components. And this is all Material UI is. It's a handful of pre-style components for us. So you can see here we've got everything from buttons to checkboxes to radio buttons, switch, text fields, cards, dividers, tables, dialogues. And if you click on some of these, such as say, what would be a fun one, like menu, for instance. You can see menu here is a kind of menu like this. Now, this is a very simple, what you might call a primitive library. Maybe not quite, some of it's primitive. Not primitive as in terms of basic, but primitives are like fundamental components, right? So like on a website, a primitive is a thing like a button and a text input. And you might think of components, therefore, as something like this that uses those things together, and pages as a series of components. But these are all very arbitrary lines that don't really have, super strong definitions. But if we come here, and now that that's done, and we start this React app up, what we'll see is we have our little hello app here. Now, I would like to use one of these components here, such as, let's find a simple one. What's a dialog? What does that look like? Okay, open simple dialog. Oh, that's a nice little one. So let's try that. So if we want to use something like this, we can actually see an example we want. And typically there's a whole bunch of examples, such as this one. And if you like an example, you can just click on this show source code underneath and copy and paste it, right? I'm going to go and find a simpler one to start, just so you can get a feel for it. And I'm just going to pick button. So buttons are really easy. If I open the source code here, you can see that there's a few different button types. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just quite literally copy and paste this button here. You can see that those three buttons are all the same button component, but they have slightly different properties. I'm just going to move my face for this particular moment. It's got three different properties, right? Which is contained and outlined and text. So now when I come to my page, you'll see the button's not defined because I have not imported it from the Material UI library. Whereas now it's here. Now, this looks a lot like what was on the web page. and I can change what's inside of that. I can say hello, and there's my button, and you can see that it's got a nice color. When I click on it, it does this like nice little wavy motion. That's just probably CSS properties built into it. And we can take this further if we want, right? If we want to make it a disabled button, we can just add disabled to it. And again, the Material UI component library has all of the CSS built into this. Sorry, I had to sneeze. It has all of these styles built into it. And if you go further down, you'll see even more types of buttons. You can change the color of the button. So you see here how we have a contained variant. We can actually give it a success color. And all of these buttons will tend to follow a fairly similar color format. And these libraries have these universal, like for instance, if I go Material UI colors, you'll see that there's often, depends on the library, but there's often a very simple predetermined set of colors, right? Or, you know, in this case, here's just a handful of ones you see, and these are like primary colors and set, like, I'm not elaborating on this particularly well, but the point is that a lot of these libraries have themes, and those themes tend to have colors, and those colors are often defined by fairly simple names, such as success, right? Let me undisable this. Such as success, and info, and warning, and primary, which is usually blue, and secondary, right? All these different colors. I mean, what's really useful about libraries like this is if you define your page not thinking about, oh, this is the blue color, but this is the primary color, what it means is that if you want to go and change a theme, Material UI, because it's a nice little abstraction, will be able to go and update all of those things accordingly for you as well. So if we want to do something more interesting than, say, a button, maybe we'll go back to what we had before, which was a dialog. I can see an open alert dialog I like here, and there's a lot of code, but I'm just going to go and copy. I usually copy these in two parts. I've got the HTML part, and then I'll go and import the library. So you see there I've got my button variant and open dialog. I can also see that if I look at the sample code here that they've actually also got some dynamic code for us. So, you know, these libraries aren't just a bunch of HTML components. They're often also a few like use states and other things. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff I need to import here. I don't need to import button again because I already got that, so I can go and copy and paste this. Now I've got some compilation problems. React is not defined. It wants React imported because I'm using the use state hook. And now we've got this open alert dialog. And when I click on it, I get this nice little dialog. Great. I could go and clean up this code a little bit, right? I might look at this and think, oh, this looks a little bit ugly, you know, like these const functions are so simple, they could reduce it down to that. And when you really look at the code here, you can see that we've got our button for open alert dialog, and then we've got our handle click, which just sets it to be open. And then our dialog component itself is only open if open is true, and on close we call handle close. So you can see that it's really just a boilerplate way of trying to just get some basic React functionality here, and then you can go and change everything you want inside of this. And in fact, you could customize it further, right? Like what happens if you want to have another button that isn't just agree or disagree, but like come back later? You can just go and modify these kinds of basic components and give yourself lots of different things. And what happens if someone hits come back later? Or what happens if someone disagrees and you want to give them an alert? And you say, no, I don't want you to disagree. Now it's like I click disagree and I get that, you know? So that would be mean. But you get the point. It's like you're just kind of using these, and it's a lot of copying and pasting, and then it's a lot of modifying. What you'll find with these component libraries is sometimes I draw this little chart out for people, which is that if you look at, if you draw a chart of, say, you know, how much you want something to look how you look, how you intend for it to look, right? If you were to chart this where the x-axis is like how much you want it for something to look, and over here is like the effort involved. Well, you know, if the effort involved here is like, you know, infinity, and the effort here is like 0, and how much you want it to look like what you intended for here is 0, and this is like 100%. Well, here's what you're going to notice with component libraries. They're going to follow a fairly straightforward curve that's going to look like that. Where to get something that kind of 80% looks how you want it to, it's going to be like no effort at all, right? Like you look at this and you think, yeah, that looks nice, little pop-up and stuff. But the second you want to say do something slightly more interesting, like I want to put an icon here, and then you start trying to like navigate through the code and be like, all right, there's a dialog title. Well, what happens if I put like a little, I'll make just like a little div here, right? That's like a 50 pixel width and a 50 pixel height and say background red, just a little placeholder for us. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's hard. Put a little red box here. Oh, damn it, it's not going in the right spot. I just want it to sit to the left of that. Here it's probably going to be okay. You're like, damn, it's still not going in the right spot. It's like, well, that's because, you know, it's a div element, but let's make it float left. This one will probably be fine. And you're like, cool, okay, well, that one kind of worked, but now how do I change the padding of that text, right? Because normally if I was just coding this manually, I would go and change the padding of the text here, and you think, well, maybe I can try this, and I just kind of pulled this example out. The point is, though, that you're essentially taking something that's pre-prepared, right? And it's just like everything in life. If something's pre-prepared, it's going to be harder to kind of wind it back to how you want it sometimes. But in this case, for instance, it's probably okay to rip this apart a bit. 20 pixel padding. Ooh, okay, maybe I can't. Margin top. Okay, so, and again, I could figure this out, but it's like, you can see here how suddenly you're like, oh, okay, well, maybe this can be a div, and then suddenly your code, okay, so if it's a div, that makes sense. Starting to look a little bit cleaner. Give it a margin left, and you know, and then your code starts to turn into spaghetti. I think this one has to be a padding left. Maybe not. You can play around with it, right? The point is that just a little bit of manipulation. Often you can solve things pretty quickly. This is probably like getting into this area here, but sometimes you will just bash your head against the wall. And you just have to go into these component libraries knowing that they're probably often going to only be 90% how you want them, right? So like if you look at the course website, Eccles, most of this turned out pretty well. You know, the things turned out relatively similar to how they were wanted, and often the things that didn't, like for instance, I really wanted to get rid of some of these card backgrounds, and I figured that out in the end, but there was a little bit of a struggle there. Probably the main thing that was difficult was getting some of these like sidebars things working, because I couldn't quite find a component that did what I wanted it to, so I had to kind of rip a couple of things apart. You know, that took a lot of time. That's where, like, you know, the whole, you know, the 80-20 rule, right? Like 80% of your effort spent on 20% of the output, or whatever it is, whatever incarnation of that sentence exists. But you get the idea. So you can take this further and further and start adding more and more buttons, and I don't really need to go through a whole example because, like, you get the idea. It's just this layering on top, and you'll find so much stuff here. You will find progress, right? Progress bar. So if you want to have this little loading screen whilst you're talking to the server, that's a great thing to do. You can again just go and copy that in. I'd be like, oh, I'm going to take this circle progress and I'll just put it on my page, and then I'll just import this line, and all of these items here are part of what you npm installed, and it's like, great, now we have that. So now what I could do is I could maybe only show that if the dialog is open, right? Now this makes no sense at all, but you get the point. Like, you can start conditionally rendering with this stuff. So it's not there, and then I click open alert dialog and it appears, and then I click agree and it goes back. Very powerful ways to build things quickly, right? Like, once you understand React, and now that you understand a component library, you can do things very quickly. And I said in a previous lecture that the initial incarnation of this course website, maybe it looks different when you're watching this video probably, it took about, you know, it was a day. It was pretty much a day in terms of just the UI, because it was just, this is a sidebar from Material UI. This was built in Material UI. I'm pretty sure this was based on, was it navbar? Often I just Google these things. Like, I often don't look through this. I'll often just be like, oh, navbar Material UI, and then it'll app bar React. And you'll see very similar things. Like, there's the app bar. And you'll see if we go further down that, what do they call the slidey thing? I think it's a drawer. Is it a drawer? Yeah, it's this, right? It's a drawer component. It appears. It's like a drawer that you slide out. So that's where that kind of comes from, you know? And it was modified. And I went and found an example that had like a multi-level drawer. Some of these won't be on the actual Material UI website, though. Some of these things you will have to go and look up online. You'll have to just Google things for particular examples. I don't think there was a multi-level example here. But again, if you feel like exploring more and seeing what more was done, go check out the source code for the course site, because all of that's sitting inside the front-end source folder. And you can go and see a whole bunch of stuff, like, you know, the course outline page, for instance, is made up of a whole, if I go to the actual course outline, if you go and have a look, the whole course outline page is made up of a series of topography and dividers, and these are all Material UI components. You can intermingle them with like your standard your standard like HTML components too, right? Here's an ordered list and a list item. We got more topography, unordered list items, dividers, you know, tables, and this table comes from Material UI, and you'll see that in things like the course outline too. This table comes from Material UI. It's a Material UI table with a Material UI button. Very, very straightforward stuff. So that's the crux of it. That's what I'd probably recommend you spend time with. The third type of styling that exists is the use of styled components. Styled components are something that aren't unique to React. They exist. It's kind of a library that is just a JavaScript wrapper of CSS, and I'll just find one for you. It's actually an example of it used in the course site. Let me just find that. So there's actually a file inside of the Eccles repo that you'll see, at least again at the time of 22T1, called appload. And appload is a really, really simple component, and it's something, if you watch the left page, you'll see it really quick when I load it. You see a little flashy. It was very brief. It was like a little circle thing. It's the same circle thing that we saw before, right? Circle progress here. And the way this component works is there's pretty much a loading wrapper, which is just a div, and then inside of that I have either, if there is no error, right, then I show the circle progress, and if there is an error, I say please try again later. And basically what happens is I've also got a timeout here where if 10 seconds passes and you don't get sent off the page, then it forces an error because it assumes that the server times out. And the way this particular component is actually used, if we look it up, is it's actually used here inside of like a wrapper for all the pages, where essentially what happens on every page is that a request is made to the server to get information, and whilst that information is not populated, the page has not loaded, and therefore it shows this component. So the second the server returns the data, the component that's using it no longer renders it, and therefore it disappears. So it's kind of either loading or an error stage, because once it's no longer loading, it's just not rendered anymore. But the point is that we're using a Material UI component here, circular progress, but I also used to have a div here. And this div used to have a whole bunch of styles on it. And you might be thinking, oh, well, okay, Hayden, well, I've been told that using this kind of global CSS is bad, and it is bad. The reason it's bad is because in React, when you import CSS this way, like the old school way, like in index.js, it's actually imported globally, so those styles are available throughout the entire application, whereas when you're making kind of styles with a component, in a true component composition design pattern approach, you want to make sure that everything in this component is completely self-contained, because that component should be separable and isolated and reusable. But I don't want to have a div here with all these styles, and I don't really know how to like break it up into its own file with a class. So what you can actually do is use these styled components piece from Material UI, and in fact there's actually a style components library that doesn't rely on Material UI. You can go and check it out online. It's a little bit different, but the same gist. It's basically a library where you can go and define a component as essentially a styled version of the A tag, as in, the A HTML tag that has these CSS properties. So what's happening here with Material UI's styled function is a very similar thing. It's basically the same, just in a slightly different code format, where it's saying that the loading wrapper is actually going to be a styled HTML div with these CSS properties, right? So now loading wrapper is kind of like a custom property, like a custom component with these like custom styles. Now what's exciting is if you would like to reuse this loading wrapper component, you can simply take it and go and export it to another file. So if you wanted to have, say, a whole bunch of your own primitives or your own things that you want to modify, then you can go ahead and do that. And what's even more exciting about how Material UI works is that this doesn't have to be a div. You can actually reuse and continue on this composition approach where you say like loading wrapper big, and you can say it's a styled version of loading wrapper where it has more properties such as, width is 400 pixels, and it will inherit the previous properties and expand on that. So there's this kind of beautiful inheritance approach that you can apply here to actually defining your own custom styles. And this is definitely something I would recommend that you go and do if you are trying to take these, like, define your own primitives, so to speak, which you kind of do sometimes, right? Because there's lots of things where Material UI just doesn't, or any component library, it just doesn't have the component or the primitive you're looking for. So you're going to have to go and make your own. Now this is great if you're going to go and make your own, which is the third part here, using style components, a custom middle ground to fine-tune components while still making them reusable, right? So more reusable than this old style CSS, more fine-tuned than Material UI. However, let's say that you have a Material UI component like a button on our page here, and you want to just make a little bit of a change to it, right? Well, to make just a little bit of a change to something, most Material UI components are able to just have a style dumped on them, like this, where I could say, style is like width 200 pixels. That usually changes it. Though you'll notice that for Material UI, you'll often see this SX prop used around the internet, and essentially it's a little bit more versatile with some of the stuff it can do. So when you use style, it's essentially just applying that to like the raw element itself, whereas SX, as you can see here, custom style that has access to the theme. So themes are something we're not really talking about in this lecture because we can only talk about so much. That we could talk for millions of hours. But if you want to, a Material UI theme is essentially where you can go and kind of change all your colors and all of your formats in like a universal way. Though honestly, for the sake of this course, we really think that just something simple is fine. Like this course website is using all the standard Material UI themes and it looks fine. But if you want to go spend some time looking into different kinds of themes and explore things you can do with the SX property, that's fine. Just use this kind of thing sparingly with custom styles. In fact, I would generally recommend that if you're putting more than a style on this, that what you probably do is you probably go and start using the styled library and you start saying, well, just so that my code is particularly clean, I'm gonna come up here and I'm gonna say, well, styled like that. And then I'll say, big button equals styled button like this. And then you can say width 200 pixels like that. And then you should be able to take big button and put it here like this. It's probably not going to work. Probably forgotten something. 200 pixels like this. JSX closing tag is missing because I forgot to copy the closing tag. And now we have that big button there, right? And then this is just really handy because this shows that you can componentize things, because as we'll keep reiterating in the lectures, it's like custom, like this is not bad. What's bad is putting style on a particular tag, because once you put style on a particular tag, that tag is often not very reusable. It's not very separable. What's nice about this is I can come along and I can copy and paste it into another file and I can import it if I want to. I can't do that the other way around. So lots of little lessons here, but again, this lecture is more just to help you get a feel for things, and hopefully we've done that a little bit. So good luck making some UIs very, very quickly.